But of course, it was not Mother Culture's teaching that everything from the past was to be discarded. What was to be saved? What in fact was saved? I would say it was information about how to make things, about how to do things. Anything related to production was definitely saved, and that's how things came to be this way. Yes, of course the leaders save information about production too, though production for its own sake is rarely a feature of their lives. Among the leaders, people don't have weekly quotas of popes to make out or arrowheads to turn out. They're not preoccupied with stepping up their production of hand axes. True. So although they save information about production, most of the information they save is about something else. How could you characterize that information? I'd say you gave away the answer to that question a few minutes ago. I'd say it comes to what works well for them. For them? Not for everyone? No, I'm not an anthropology buff, but I've read enough of it to know that the Sunji don't think their way is the way for everyone, and the Navajo don't think their way is the way for everyone. Each of them has a way that works well for them, and that way that works well for them the is what they teach their children. Yes, and what we teach our children is how to make things, how to make more things and better things. Why don't you teach them what works well for people? I'd say it's because we don't know what works well for people. Every generation has to come up with its own version of what works well for people. My parents had their version, which was pretty well useless, and their parents had their versions, which was pretty well useless. And we're currently working on a version which will probably seem pretty well useless to our own children. Can I keep going? Sure. Okay. I let the conversation stray from its course. Ishmael said grumpily and shifted to an indecision, rocking the wagon on its springs. What I want you to see is that each lever culture is an accumulation of knowledge that reaches back in an unbroken chain to the beginning of human life. This is why it's no great wonder to each of them is a way that works well. Each has been tested and refined over thousands of generations. Yes, sometimes occurs to me. Go ahead, give me a minute. This has something to do with the unavailability of knowledge about how people ought to live. Take your time. Okay. I said a few minutes later. Back at the beginning, when I said that there were no such thing as certain knowledge about how people ought to live, what I meant was this. Certain knowledge is knowledge of the one right way. That's what we want. That's what the takers want. We don't want to know a way to live that works well. We want to know the one right way, and that's what our prophets give us, and that's what our lawgivers give us. Let me think about this. After 5 or 8 thousand years of amnesia, the takers really didn't know how to live. They really must have turned their backs on the past because all of them here comes Hammurabi, sorry, and everyone says, "What are these?" And Hammurabi says, "These, my children, are laws." Laws? What are laws? And Hammurabi says, "Laws are things that tell you that the one right way to live." What I am trying, what am I trying to say? I'm not sure. Maybe it's this. When you started talking about our cultural amnesia, I thought you were, sorry, I thought you were being prodigal, or maybe exaggerating a little to make a point, because obviously you can't know what those Neolithic farmers were thinking. Nevertheless, here's the fact. After a few thousand years, the descendants of these Neolithic farmers were scratching their heads and saying, "Gee, I wonder how people ought to live." But in that very same time period, the leaders of the world hadn't forgotten how to live. They still knew, but the people of my culture had forgotten, had cut themselves off from a tradition that told them how to live. They needed a Hammurabi to tell them how to live. They needed a Draco and a Solon and a Moses and a Jesus and a Muhammad. And believers didn't because they had a way, had a whole bunch of ways that, hold on, I think I've got it. Take your time. Every one of the levers' ways came into being by evolution, by a process of testing that began even before people had a word of it. No one said, okay, let's form a committee to write up a set of laws for us to follow. None of these cultures were up a set of laws for us to follow. None of these cultures were inventions, but that's what all our lawgivers gave us, inventions, contrivances, not things that had proved out over thousands of generations, but rather arbitrary pronouncements about the one right way to live. And this is still what's going on. The laws they make in Washington aren't put on the books because they work, make in well, they're put on the books because they represent the one right way to live. You may not have an abortion unless the fetus is threatening your life or was put there by a rapist. There are a lot of people who'd like to see the law read that way. Why? Because that's the only right way to live. You may drink yourself to death, but you but if we catch you smoking a marijuana cigarette, it's the slammer for you, baby, because that's the one right way. No one gives a damn about whether our laws works well. Working well is beside the point. Again, I'm not sure what I'm getting at. Ishmael grunted. You're not necessarily getting at one specific thing. You're exploring a deep complex of ideas, and you can't expect to to the bottom of it in 20 minutes. True. However, there is a point I set out to make here before we go on to other things, and would like to make it. Okay, you see now that the takers and believers accumulate two entirely different kinds of knowledge. Yes, the takers accumulate knowledge about what works well for things. Believers accumulate knowledge about what works well for people, but not for all people. Each lever people has a system that works well for them because it evolved among them. It was suited to the terrain in which they lived, suited to the climate in which they lived, suited to the biological community in which they lived, suited to their own peculiar taste, preferences, and vision of the world. Yes, and this kind of knowledge is called what? I don't know what you mean. Someone who calls what works well for the people has what? Well, wisdom. Of course. Now you know that the knowledge of what works well for production is what's valued in your culture. In the same way, the knowledge of what works well for people is what's valued in leavers' cultures. And every time the takers stamp out a lever culture, a wisdom ultimately tested since the birth of mankind disappears from the world beyond recall. Just as every time they stamp out a species of life, a life form ultimately tested since the birth of life disappears from the world beyond recall. Ugly, I said. Yes, Ishmael said, it is ugly. After a few minutes of head scratching and earlobe tugging, Ishmael sent me away for the night. I'm tired, he explained. I am too cold to think.